Normally when you embark a cruise, you've got to make sure that you've packed your summer clothes to go to the beach, and maybe even some swimwear so that you can jump straight into the pool when you get on board. That is not what happened on my last cruise though. When we embarked the ship, I was hoping that I'd remember to pack enough pairs of thermal trousers, and most importantly, I was hoping that I'd packed enough seasickness tablets. On this cruise, I was heading 1,700 miles up into the Arctic Circle to the very top of Norway to try and find the ever mysterious Northern Lights. The place that I was cruising to is actually so far north that they have a continuous night for 2 months where the sun never rises above the horizon. It's safe to say that this wasn't a regular cruise and things didn't always go smoothly, and that is a massive understatement. I always thought that to see the Northern Lights you'd have to stand around for hours in the cold on the side of a mountain, or maybe take a trip on a small postal boat. So when I saw a mainstream cruise line that I recognised making this trip, I knew that this was my chance. I had to give it a go. I'd heard that seeing the lights by ship was even better than by land, so I crossed my fingers as tightly as I could. Checking in for the cruise was straightforward, and as we embarked, I began to wonder who else would be on this cruise. The cruise ship that I booked this cruise on was Fred Olsen's Ballet, and Fred Olsen are a traditional cruise line that tend to have an older than average passenger demographic. I didn't want to stand out being in my 20s, but for me this cruise was really about the itinerary, and if I liked the cruise ship or the cruise line, that would be a bonus. The cruise was 9 nights long, and I really hoped that I would enjoy it, especially considering the fact that we had 4 sea days, and I'd driven 330 miles to board the ship. I drove from very close to the biggest cruise port in England, all the way up to the northeast, up to Newcastle to board this cruise. Our first evening on board was fantastic. We went to dinner, we met new friends, and we saw a show in the theatre that explained a little bit more about what this cruise would be like. During the show, they introduced 4 guest speakers who would be hosting talks during our cruise about all kinds of things, from Vikings to how to photograph the Northern Lights. At this point, I had no idea what was about to hit me, but this was very much the calm before the storm. The North Sea does have a reputation for rough seas, and although I've cruised a lot, I was totally unprepared. When the captain announced to the ship that the seas were looking rough, I thought to myself, right, that's it, I'm going to take my normal seasickness medication. I went to bed, and I hoped that that would be the end of it. I'll spare you the gory details, but I spent the next day in bed feeling as though I was on a roller coaster that I could not get off of. I wanted to stop, but you can't stop when you're in the middle of the sea. I've been cruising for 18 years, and although I do get seasick on a handful of occasions, I had never been sick like this before. It was like my normal seasickness medication didn't even touch the sides, and I only really woke up to eat bread rolls. I couldn't even face drinking a glass of Pepsi or eating a cookie, and when I turned down a Pepsi, you know that something is seriously wrong. I knew though that we were docking the next day, and I was really looking forward to getting my feet back on solid ground. I hoped that the seas were just this rough because we were making the crossing across the North Sea, and I was optimistic that because we were cruising close to the coast for the next few days, that the seas would be calmer. I had to believe that. All I could think about was how it would be worth it when we saw the Northern Lights, but I knew that there was a very real possibility that we wouldn't see anything at all. Technically, the Northern Lights are out year-round, but it needs to be dark enough to see them, so the prime time to go and see the Northern Lights tends to be between September-October time and March. I knew that I needed to be awake to see the lights though, and that was something that I'd not done much of on this cruise up until this point. Our first port on this cruise was Alta, and this was my first experience of real snow. We do get snow in the UK if you count an on average 4.6 days of snow that rarely settles on the ground. The snow in Alta was up to my knees in some places, and it was quite an experience trying to wander around. For me, having just got off of that rocky ship, I was very happy just to be standing still. Sadly, our ship was sailing away at 1 PM, so we had to be all aboard by 12:30. I definitely wasn't expecting it to be such a short stay in the port, but I was grateful that we stopped somewhere up on our journey into the Arctic Circle. The sail away was absolutely beautiful, and at this point I thought that this was cold. How wrong I was, it was about to get much, much colder. The next day I started to feel a little bit better. I still slept for most of the day, but I had 2 things on my schedule that I really didn't want to miss. I had booked afternoon tea first of all, so I knew that I had to make an effort to be okay for that. Despite the fact that the horizon was going up and down as I watched it, I ate more at this afternoon tea than I had in the last couple of days, and I did start to feel an awful lot better from this point, which was a massive relief to me. If this was my first cruise, I probably would have wanted to get off on that first day, but I knew that this was not a normal cruise experience. I did meet other guests on board, and when they told me that this was their first cruise, I tried to make it understood that most cruises were not like this. I didn't want them to be put off of cruising based on the motion on this cruise. This is not normal. The second thing on my schedule for the day was to watch the ceremony that they put on as you sail into the Arctic Circle. People cruising into the Arctic Circle for the first time were invited to take part in what is called the Balloon Nose ceremony. I took part in a ceremony like this way back in 2018 on a Viking cruise. In the ceremony, guests had ice-cold water poured down their backs, and I could not believe just how many people were lining up for doing this. When I did the ceremony on my Viking cruise, we had to climb into a pool of ice, take a shot of aquavit, I think that's what it's called, and then have blue cream put on our nose. It was absolutely freezing, but it was so much fun. In some places, the ceremony does include kissing a dead fish, so I'm glad that we didn't have to do that. By the way, nobody has to do this. You're not forced to do this to get into the Arctic Circle. It's just a bit of fun. The ceremony takes place by the main pool in an area that has a retractable roof, which was very, very useful for this cruise. There's a bar here, there's a poolside restaurant here too that's included in the cruise fare, and I ate there a lot during this cruise. I loved the atmosphere, the staff was so kind, the food was so good. They would even hand out blankets because it was chilly. We were in the Arctic Circle. It might not look that cold, and that's because these pools are heated to 25 degrees Celsius. Let me just work that out in Fahrenheit. 78 is the answer. 78 Fahrenheit was the pause. The next sea day gave me a chance to properly explore the ship. She was bought from another cruise line called Holland America in 2020, and even though the ship was launched in 2000, I don't think you would know that by just looking at her. Sure, in some areas the carpets did feel a little bit wacky, but nothing ever felt damaged, it didn't feel old. It felt as though the ship was very well looked after, and I could tell how much the other guests and the crew really loved this ship. It was a really nice feeling. It was on the sea day heading up to Tromso that I really started to get excited about the possibility of seeing the Northern Lights. My friend David, who's a guest speaker on board and a little bit of a Northern Lights expert, did keep reminding me that we might never see anything, but I really, really hoped that we would. I said that I wouldn't be disappointed if we didn't, but I would. It sounds a little bit counterintuitive, but it turns out that a phone can see the Northern Lights way before the human eye can. We were told to scan the sky with our phones and that we might see something showing up as green. Of course, I did this every single time I saw the sky, and when I came back from this cruise, I had to delete thousands of photos of just black night sky, but I wasn't about to miss it. The first recorded photo of the Northern Lights was taken in 1892, and I don't know why, but this photo just makes me laugh so much to look at it. Of course, I know photos taken back then were in black and white, but looking at this could just be a cloud for all I know. I took a photo of the night sky, and to my surprise, it came out looking like this. To my eyes, I couldn't see anything, but I'm convinced that there is a very slight bit of green here. Let me know in the comments if you think this counts as a Northern Lights sighting. Either way, I really hope that this wouldn't be it. After spending the first couple of days feeling so rough, I didn't want to come home just with this photo. To my absolute delight, we had 2 port days next, and we were docked in port for the full days. This was great, not just because the ship wouldn't be moving for a while, but because it gave us loads of time to explore the ports. These next 2 days were our best chance of seeing the Northern Lights. Our next port stop was in Tromso, and it's very common to come to Tromso on land-based trips to try and find the Northern Lights. It's actually the biggest city in northern Norway, and it was so bizarre for me to see life just going on as normal amongst all of this snow. In the UK, if an inch of snow falls, the trains break, cars crash into things, and really everything just goes wrong. But in Norway, they have it covered, and I understand, of course, they need to. Here they experience what is called a polar night, where the sun doesn't rise above the horizon at all between mid-November and January. In the summer, they also have what is called the midnight sun, where the sun doesn't set at all between May and July. I imagine if you're born here, you're just used to it, but for me, there's something about the sun never setting that I think would drive me crazy. I guess it would just be like sleeping in an inside cabin, and I'm used to that, so I just have to bring my daylight alarm clock, maybe. Our day in Tromso was the first day where stargazing and Northern Lights watching was on the schedule. We had dinner as normal and then got changed into our thermal clothes, ready to stand up on the top deck. I had thermal trousers underneath my thermal trousers, thermal socks underneath other thermal socks, and I was still absolutely freezing. For my birthday, my mum gave me one of these neck warmer things. It's like a scarf without any ends, and this was absolutely the best. It stopped the cold from coming into my coat, and it was just toasty and warm. I did see other guests that had heated hand warmers, some people had heated jackets on. It was very, very high tech. In total, we stood outside on the promenade deck for 3 hours this night, which might sound boring, but it really actually wasn't. Apart from taking about 15,000 photos on my phone and chatting to the other guests, occasionally we would come in for a Pepsi and hope that that wasn't the time that the Northern Lights came out. They come and they go very fast. The crew did bring out hot drinks to us. They did their best to grit and clear the snow off of the deck, but of course it was still slippy. It snows on the ship. Quite a few of the other guests had walking sticks or they had walkers, but they never let that hold them back from standing up on that top deck. It is a bucket list experience to see the Northern Lights and nobody was willing to miss it. I think maybe that's a bit of the Northern Lights magic that makes you stand outside for many, many hours in the cold. When it got to midnight and we hadn't seen anything, we decided to call it a night. By that point, I genuinely couldn't have told you how many toes I had. It felt like I just had 2 giant blocks of ice at the end of my feet. My nose was so cold too, I genuinely couldn't have told you if my nose had fallen off. I probably wouldn't have noticed. I was disappointed at not having seen the Northern Lights, but I knew that tomorrow we would be sailing during the evening, and that would be our best chance. That really would be our last chance because we were sailing out of the Arctic Circle. You can, of course, see the Northern Lights from cities, but when you're at sea, you're away from all of that light pollution, and it makes it more likely, so I really hope that it will come out for us. The Northern Lights actually come from the sun originally. It is bizarre, but the sun has lots of explosions of matter, and it fires all of these particles into the air, billions of miles away. The particles make their way to Earth for a couple of days before we're able to see them, so hopefully when I was laying in bed seasick, the sun was preparing an amazing Northern Lights display for me. That's what I hoped. Fred Olsen did say that they would make announcements if the Northern Lights were spotted as long as they were before 11 p.m. That meant that if we went to bed after this time and they came out, we would have no idea. I couldn't stand outside forever though. It was minus 10 Celsius, which is 14 Fahrenheit. And apparently that's quite warm for Tromso's position, but it didn't feel warm. I also knew that I had the best excursion in the world booked for the next day, so I was pretty happy to go to bed. The next day we arrived in Alta, which is the most northerly port on our trip. I don't usually book many cruise and excursions, but I thought if I'm going all the way to the Arctic Circle, I'm going to treat myself and I'm going to book one. So I booked myself an excursion to go and see 40 happy Huskies at a Husky farm. Farm doesn't really seem like the right word, but I guess it is. It was like a petting zoo but for Huskies. Alta marks the start and the end of Europe's longest dog sled race, and these dogs race 1,100 kilometers in around a week. They do of course have vet checks every single day on all of the dogs to make sure that they're okay and that they want to keep running. I genuinely couldn't believe just how full of energy Huskies are. Never met dogs like that. A friend of mine saw one of the races ending and he said he was so moved by the way that the person got off of the sled and went straight over to their dogs to check that their dogs were okay and to, I guess, thank them for pulling them hundreds of miles. They didn't really care about their win, they were just looking after their Huskies, which I thought was really cool. When we met the Huskies, they were jumping up and down, they were climbing over each other to try and get a place to pull a sled. Before this, I wouldn't have believed that a dog would want to run that far, but my goodness, Huskies have so much energy, and all the ones that we met were so unbelievably friendly. They would give us cuddles, they'd even dance with us, but they did smell, they really did smell. I kind of thought to myself, this must be what dogs smell like if you don't wash them. And they live outside. They smell. I'm very glad I have a cat that washes himself, and I hope that the dog smell would wash off before I got back to my house, or my cat would never forgive me. Your Britishism of the week is how I would refer to what I am doing to this dog here. In the UK, we would normally say, can I stroke your dog? And in the US, it seems as though you normally say, can I pet a dog? To me, that sounds odd, and I would always say stroke. Either way, though, these dogs seem to really like the attention, so strokes and pets all round. I loved hanging out with the dogs, and this was a trip highlight for me. I hope, though, that this highlight would be surpassed by seeing the Northern Lights. It was actually while I was sat at dinner that I heard the first rumours that the Northern Lights were outside. We just finished our main when other guests came back to their tables talking about having seen the lights. We decided to skip dessert and just run straight outside to have a look. I was only wearing a dress because I'd just been at dinner, so it became apparent very, very quickly that I couldn't stay outside dressed like that for very long. We walked very fast, we didn't run, but we almost ran back to our cabins, and we quickly put on layer upon layer of thermals. This was one of the benefits of the ship not being very big. We were always pretty close to our cabin. It was quite tricky to get changed in such a rush, but we did manage it. I'm sure my socks were all twisted and the back of my shirt wasn't on right, but it didn't matter. I just wanted to get outside and see the Northern Lights. We headed out to the back of the ship to this lovely pool area that I imagine would be very, very nice on a warm cruise. People did swim in this pool. It was also heated, but I was not brave enough to do that on this cruise. When I pointed my phone at the sky, I saw something, or at least I thought I saw something. Maybe. It wasn't even properly dark yet when I took this photo, so I was hoping that things would get better as it got darker, as the evening went on. I was not going to let the sky out of my sights though. I had a really good feeling about this. It was around 9 p.m. that we went back inside briefly to warm up and to get a drink in the piano bar. It was here that they made an announcement telling us that the Northern Lights were outside, and they told us where we should go to see them, what side they were on. At this point, almost everybody in the bar stood up, they put their coats on and they ran outside. Most people left their drinks behind, and it was so strange to see a bar empty out so quickly. We headed up to the top deck, and this was where things started to get really exciting. We found a dark corner that was a little bit further back from the main pool, so it was ever so slightly protected from the wind. It was still absolutely freezing, but it was protected enough that we could take a couple of photos before your hand would kind of freeze into that position and you had to put your gloves back on. In the distance, we started to see some faint kind of movements, what looked like clouds, but looking through my phone, it definitely looked green, so I knew that I had to just stand there and wait, and hopefully it would get stronger rather than go away. Amazingly, they did get stronger, and I could see that they were green with my eyes alone. The phones do make them look a lot brighter, but I could see without a doubt with my eyes that the sky was green. It kind of looked like someone was just shining a green light up at some clouds, and I did wonder for a second if the cruise line had just thought, oh, we'll just shine some green lights at the sky. They went, no, but it definitely was the Northern Lights. This was not our best sighting of them though, that would come later. The Northern Lights are actually 100 kilometers into the sky, so although it felt as though we could kind of reach out and touch them, they can be seen from space. They are very, very high up. The thing that surprised me most was how fast these lights moved and changed. I thought they would be like clouds, they kind of roll in, they'd roll out. No, if you look away for 10 seconds, 15 seconds, they could be completely gone. If you badly time a trip to the toilet, you might never see them at all. We decided to head back to our balcony cabin because we were pretty content with what we'd seen, and we were of course absolutely freezing. But this was where the real show began. Without warning, this bright green light just shot across the sky. It was in the wavy pattern that you see on TV and what you think of when you think of the Northern Lights. It was tricky to take photos because the best way to take photos of the Northern Lights is to use what's called a long exposure, and that basically means that it takes a picture over a couple of seconds, and when you do that you really want to be standing still, so only what you're photographing is moving. But when you're on a ship that is moving, you cannot stand still. You just can't. The ship's moving. Still, we tried our best. We took loads and loads of photos, and this is how this photo came out of my phone. This is not edited. It didn't look quite that bright in real life, but it still was very, very impressive. When I stood here, I thought about an article that I'd read recently about the feeling of awe and about how seeking out that feeling of awe can make us healthier and make us live longer. It described the feeling of awe like a little earthquake in your mind, and I think that sums this up perfectly. It felt like an earthquake in my mind. I took another cruise recently that caused an earthquake in my mind, but for a very, very different reason. When I was sat on board Ambassador's newest cruise ship, I was eating dinner and the cruise was cancelled. Awe is all about experiencing things that you didn't know were possible, and I did not know a cruise could be cancelled while I was on board. To find out what happened and if I would cruise with that cruise line again, watch this video next.